Hello, my friends. How are you? Welcome to 30 Albums for 30 Years, 1964 through 1994. I am your host, Jay Sweet. In this podcast, we take a look at the 30 most impactful albums between that period of 1964 through 1994, and we do it chronologically or close thereto. So the goal is 900 albums, if I make it that far. Today, we're going to be checking out the album Phil Ochs' I Ain't Marching Anymore, Elektra Records. Recorded in 1964, but released February of 1965. Joining me on the program is Sonny Ochs. Sonny is Phil Ochs' sister, and it's a fascinating interview. You're not going to want to miss this. And just a few show notes. Things are going great with the show, thanks to you guys. And we are now being heard in 27 countries, and we recently added listeners in Singapore. So I want to welcome anyone listening in Singapore. So let's get into it. Phil Ochs' I Ain't Marching Anymore. Okay, so before I get into my interview with Sonny Ochs, I want to talk a little bit about Phil Ochs' life and his career. So if you thought that Bob Dylan was the only impactful folk protest singer to emerge in the 1960s, you would be sadly mistaken. One of Dylan's greatest contemporaries was Phil Ochs. Ochs was a singer, he was a poet, he was a songwriter, and a guitarist, quite a good guitarist actually, whose music and activism deserved wider recognition. Phil Ochs was born in 1940 in El Paso, Texas, into a middle-class Jewish family. His father, Jack, was a medical school student, but was forced to leave his studies behind when he was drafted into the Army, and as a medical physician, he treated soldiers in World War II at the Battle of the Bulge. And having witnessed the horrors of war, he was deeply affected. He also had mental issues. His mental state and bipolar disorder affected his medical career. And as a result of these conditions, he had to change jobs regularly. He struggled to find regular work. And the family was forced to change locations due to these work-related issues. Therefore, Phil Ochs' childhood was split between towns like Far Rockaway and Perrysburg, New York, as well as Columbus, Ohio. And as a result of his condition, Phil Ochs' father was hospitalized several times due to his depression. And there is no question that seeing his father suffering deeply affected the singer, who would also later suffer from mental illness. So as a teen, Phil Ochs was a talented clarinet player, leading him to further his training on the instrument at the Capital University Conservatory of Music in Ohio at only the age of 16. And he could have likely had a career as a symphonic musician, but he discovered rock and roll and country music in his late teens, and he became inspired to move a little bit more into that direction. So after attending the Staunton Military Academy, Ochs attended Ohio State, where he studied journalism and became interested in politics, particularly the Cuban Revolution. While at the university, Ochs became inspired by the music of folk singers like Pete Seeger and Woody Guthrie. And he then began to learn the acoustic guitar and write music in that folk style. Then in his senior year, Ochs was angered that he was not made editor of the college newspaper. And he dropped out of Ohio State, and according to Sonny Ochs, they also wouldn't publish an article that was important to him. So it was enough for him, and he left college before finishing, moves to New York's Greenwich Village in 1962 to become a folk singer and activist. Then Ochs became a key member of a thriving folk scene in Greenwich Village and began to write topical songs based on articles he read in a newspaper. Beginning in 1963, Ochs began to gain notoriety with performances at the Newport Folk Festival, and in 1964, he performed at that same festival, the Newport Folk Festival once again, and played at Carnegie Hall and Town Hall. In 1964, he released his first album, All the News That's Fit to Sing, on Elektra Records. In 1965, Phil Ochs released I Ain't Marching Anymore, the record we're discussing today. It includes 12 tracks, and many feel it's his signature work. On the album, Ochs tackles a range of social and political concerns and issues that were prevalent during the era, including civil rights, nuclear proliferation, the assassination of John F. Kennedy, challenges faced by the working class, and several other protest songs. Bob Dylan took notice and said the following: "I just can't keep up with Phil. He just keeps getting better and better." Following the release of I Ain't Marching Anymore, Ochs continued to make albums throughout the 1960s, and he remained involved in political rallies and social causes. Along with Abbie Hoffman and Jerry Rubin, he was involved with the Youth International Party, a key member of the party known as the Yippies, which took an anti-war stance, protesting Vietnam. In the early 1970s, Ochs became further disenfranchised by the state of the country, and he decided to move away from political music at times and began performing music in the style of Elvis. And Ochs would go on stage now wearing kind of a ridiculous gold suit backed by a rock band, singing still his own material, but also now songs written by Buddy Holly, Elvis, and Merle Haggard. And his fans didn't really know how to respond, his older fans. During this period, he was also abusing drugs and alcohol, and he would fall into these depressions. He then went to South America, where he became involved with new social causes. And from this point on, his career was a series of ups and downs as he traveled frequently and began to really challenge international governments. Now, while in Tanzania, he was attacked and strangled by robbers, which damaged his voice and further played into his depression. Many of his international friends and colleagues who were also activists were now being imprisoned or killed, and Ochs remained somewhat unstable and fearful for his life. He began to drink more heavily and became even more frantic and erratic in the mid-1970s. He even took on the identity of a guy by the name of John Butler Train, who he said killed Phil Ochs. He told people that Ochs was murdered by Train. And the singer was convinced that someone was trying to kill him still, so he would carry weapons at times, a hammer, a knife, a lead pipe. You would see him sometimes wandering the streets of Greenwich Village, and he was really alienating many of his friends. In 1976, he settled in Far Rockaway, where he stayed with his sister and rarely left the house. Sadly, Phil Ochs committed suicide by hanging at the age of only 35. After his death, it was revealed that the FBI had a file of about 500 pages on Phil Ochs. Okay, so now that we've given you some information on the album and on Phil Ochs, it's time for me to share with you my interview with Sonny Ochs. Sonny is a music producer and a radio host, and is known for her Phil Ochs song nights that she organizes, in which various musicians sing the songs of her brother. It's a great interview. I know you're going to enjoy it. So here it is, my interview with Sonny Ochs. I'd love to talk about Phil and kind of just learn a little bit more about him and let the listeners know about this amazing guy.
Well, here's something very interesting and amazing. Fast forward to 2023, 2022, there is a young woman named Tori Nelson who lives in Iowa, who is a Phil fanatic.
Okay.
And she started a podcast. And her podcast is called God Help the Troubadour, which is a line from one of Phil's songs. And if you go on there, you or your listeners or your watchers, if you go online, just type in God Help the Troubadour podcast,
Mhm.
and it will come up. She has a podcast just about this particular album that you want to talk about today. And it's an hour and 43 minutes. She talks about the individual songs, and then she has a group of people who discuss it, and it's fascinating. So it'll be a great follow-up for this show.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll definitely share that with the listener. It's very similar to what I do as well. So before we get into the album, I was wondering if you could just kind of talk about your upbringing and what Phil was like as a child.
Okay, upbringing. We were very dysfunctional family. It was my parents, my mother, who was a very critical person, was never happy and was always criticizing. My father, who was a doctor, but not successful because he was manic depressive. And he had episodes that really, messed up his career. And so we moved around a lot. And we grew up in a time when things were on radio, like Father Knows Best or Leave It to Beaver and the Donna Reed Show. And in all of these shows, they had the perfect family. The wonderful father who's the bread provider, goes out, feeds his family nicely. The wonderful wife, lovely, stay at home, takes care of the children and raises them perfectly. And the kids who get into minor difficulties, but are always, good kids in the end. And growing up, I'm mentioning this because growing up watching that kind of thing on television, and we thought that was the normal family.
Right.
Very difficult for us. We must be weird because we're not like that. So, growing up in what turns out to be the normal family, the dysfunctional family, it was rather difficult in those days. And Phil was an introvert. Because we moved around so much, that made it really tough for him because it would take him forever to make a friend. And then he'd make a friend and then we'd move again. So he was back to square one. So this made him very introverted. And basically he lived in his own head. He loved movies and he loved to go to the movies. He watched a load of movies, much more than a normal person. But this was his escape.
Sure.
He also had a talent. He was very, very good at the clarinet,
Right.
which he took up in junior high school and was so good they made him first clarinetist in the high school band.
Mhm.
I mean, he was excellent, and that was his first musical experience.
Right.
And we had one other brother. I'm the oldest. Phil was the middle child, and then we had the younger brother, Michael. And so when Phil went away to college, well, high school was interesting too, because we lived on the grounds of a hospital in Columbus, Ohio, an area called Bexley, which was in the outskirts. And the school system there was not so great because it was a rural community, so that a lot of the students who lived on farms, so they wouldn't show up for school until October, until after the harvest was over. And then they would cut out in May because they had to help plant, the new season. They had to help on the farm. So therefore, the level of education wasn't exactly great, to put it mildly. And I guess Phil was looking at the New York Times Magazine section, and he saw an ad for Staunton Military Academy in Virginia. And he thought, oh, that might be fun, because he loved the clarinet. If I went down to Staunton Military Academy, I could play in the marching band. That would be a very good experience. So my mother was looking for a school for him, so she agreed to send him there. And as it turns out, he had two other guys who were in school at the same time as him were John Dean, who ended up being Nixon's whatever there,
Yeah.
and Michael Goldwater, who was Barry's son. So rather interesting time. And at that stage of his life, the writing, he loved to write, but he wrote short stories, and they got published very often in the school publications. And so that was the extent of his writing.
Okay.
And then when he went to college, it was just karma that he ended up having a roommate named Jim Glover. And Jim, by the way, our family was totally apolitical. I know they were registered Democrats, but they never talked about politics. All right, so there was a blank slate there. So when Phil got to college and he had Jim as a roommate, Jim's father was a socialist. He was a union activist. I mean, really, really vocal.
Mm-hmm.
They would go to Jim's home for dinner, and Mr. Glover would basically indoctrinate Phil. And so this is where Phil got his politics, was in Jim's father's house.
Very interesting. Wow. So it was like at Ohio State when this all...
Yes, they were at Ohio State. Jim also happened to be, besides having a political father, Jim Glover happened to be a very good musician. He had a great voice, played guitar, played banjo. Mm-hmm. And he taught Phil how to play the guitar, basically. And Phil got his first guitar from Jim, and he won it on a bet on the Nixon-Kennedy election.
Wow.
He won the bet, and so he won this, I think it was like a $35 K guitar, some piece of junk. But this is what he started out with. And they decided to become a duo. At first, they were going to call themselves the Singing Socialists. And of course, that doesn't really sell well. So they became the Sundowners. And I think they had one gig. The problem was Jim, with all of his talent and all of his whatever ability, was one of the, I hate to use the word lazy, but he just was just zero energy person.
Right.
Phil would write songs, and he said, "Okay, Jim, we're going to sing this song on our gig Saturday night." And of course, Saturday night, Jim hadn't even learned it, so that was out of the question. And I think one of the first gigs, maybe in their last gig, they got fired because they didn't. One of them didn't show up. I forget which one, but anyhow, that didn't work out. So Phil became a solo artist, and then Jim went to New York, discovered the Greenwich Village scene, and kept saying to Phil, "Come on, you got to come down here." Phil was majoring in journalism at Ohio State.
Yeah.
And what happened was he was writing for the Lantern, which was the school paper, and I guess he wanted to write an article that was basically pro-Castro, and they wouldn't print it. They wouldn't let him put it in the paper. So and in his senior year, he quit college, and his attitude was, if I can't write, what's the point of being a journalism major, And besides, Greenwich Village was calling rather loudly, and so that was how he got into the Village and into all of that. Right,
and when he got there, it seems like he was motivated. He was just like, once he was in that scene, he was just in it.
He was so able to write. I mean, he read the New York Times every day, and I guess he read Newsweek, and he got all of his song ideas from the headlines in the paper every day. And, he was writing nonstop. And then he got connected with who took him up to Broadside Magazine. Mm-hmm. Broadside Magazine, to me, was one of the most important things in Phil's life. And nobody else will say this, but I'll say this, because I described the family we came from, right? Mm-hmm. Okay, he got to Broadside Magazine, which was run by a couple, Sis Cunningham and Gordon Freeson. And they were motivated. Pete Seeger asked him to start the magazine. First issue came out in February of 1963, and it ran through 1982, I believe. It finally stopped. You can find it in the Smithsonian. The Smithsonian has all of the issues. Wow. So do I. And anyhow, what Broadside was, it was a magazine. It was basically a bunch of papers mimeographed together. That's how it started out, and it was so amateurish looking. But every one of the guys who were writing back in that day, I'm talking about Dylan, I'm talking about Phil, I'm talking about Eric Anderson, Tom Paxton, Buffy, all of the writers of that day in the Village, what they would do is they would go up to the apartment of Sis and Gordon. Sis and Gordon had a reel-to-reel recording machine, and they would record, these guys and women would sing their songs into the recorder. Mm-hmm. And then Sis would transcribe them, and they'd put the magazine together. So every one of them, every first song of all of these people, you'll find in Broadside Magazine. It's a treasure trove if you're looking for information about the 60s. And the reason I say that they were so important, they loved Phil. Yeah, I think overall they published about 69 of his songs. And the first time they ever put a picture on the cover, it started to evolve and get a little better. When they put a picture on the cover, issue number 36, there's a picture of Phil.
Oh, wow.
I mean,
Yeah.
they were, to me, they were his surrogate parents. Where at home he got criticism, here he got love, appreciation, recognition.
Yeah, sense of
But to
community.
me, they were the most important people.
Right, very interesting. So did you ever visit him there? Were you around that scene in Greenwich Village yourself?
I stayed home. I didn't go into the village. I lived out in Rockaway. I went to the beach instead.
Yeah. I get you. Interesting.
I wasn't into being in the. I'm not a city person. I
Right.
live in the woods even to this day. I'm a rural person, but so that's why I think Broadside was so special for Phil.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, it was a pretty remarkable time period for sure, but somewhat short-lived, I think, right? The Greenwich Village folk scene.
Yeah, but it sure did. Well, it was the right place to be in those days, because in those days, because of the Vietnam War, protest music was very important, and folk music became very important. It started out, I'd say, well, I got into folk music because of a group called the Kingston Trio.
Sure. Mm-hmm.
That was the first folk music I ever heard.
Right.
But, the purists will argue and say that's not folk music. But to me, they were terrific. Their harmonies were amazing, and they took folk songs and basically modernized them. They did a lot of old songs. Another group was the Limelighters.
Sure.
Those were the ones that got me going, and the ones that kept me going were Peter, Paul, and Mary. People put them down. They're too polished, blah, blah, blah. I have news for you. They were wonderful.
I agree with you.
And they were the reason why a lot of people turned to folk music, because they were so good. So
maybe it was their popularity that might have turned people off, but yeah, when you really break down their ability in their songs,
they were so important.
Yeah.
And then, of course, I went on the March on Washington in 1963, down in Washington, and you think about who was at that event. I mean, the musicians that were there were amazing.
Unbelievable. Mm-hmm.
And so what happened was it sort of became, it was like the mainstream music. I mean, things are so splintered today. It's horrible, absolutely horrible. But back in the day, it was basically, they had like the top 40, a lot of stations played what they call the top 40, and a lot of this music was in the top 40, and it was being heard all over the country. I mean, nowadays it's so splintered. People listen to a country station, or listen to a rap station. It's so split. But back in those days, there was more, continuity, and there was more listening to different kinds of stuff. Mm-hmm. So we've lost that now, unfortunately, because I think it's important.
I agree with you. And wow, you answered like 10 of my questions in a row, which is great. So his first album, All the News That Fit to Sing, 1964, and then I Ain't Marching Anymore.
Right.
Could you talk about the impact of that particular album?
I Ain't Marching?
Yeah.
Okay, well, it's funny. I haven't looked at his stuff in a while. I do a radio show myself, but I'm trying to stay with the old people. But I don't like to play too much of Phil, because that'd be nepotism. So I cheat. I play his songs sung by other people. But because you asked me to do this, I glanced at the album.
Sure.
And it was, wow. I have the original, the LP here. Mm-hmm. And this was so sad today that with the CDs, we've lost so much.
Yes.
You look at the album, and on the back of the album is a very interesting piece written by Phil himself. Really lovely piece. And then there's an article written by somebody named Bruce Jackson talking about Phil and his music. And then on the side, they list the songs that are on the album, and there's a little comment about each song. And I find these fascinating. And then I looked at the choice of songs. It was such an eclectic mix on this particular album. I think is fabulous because it kind of shows every side of him. There's anti-war stuff. There's humor. There's seriousness. There's a lot of stuff, civil rights.
Mhm.
Two powerful songs, In the Heat of the Summer and Here's to the State of Mississippi.
Yep.
I mean, and I Ain't Marching Anymore, of course, which became sort of his anthem. And then Draft Dodger Rag, which is a really funny takeoff about people who dodge the draft. And then this labor stuff, that's what I want to hear. I think it's one of the best labor songs that he wrote. And
Right.
it's like saying that, you're not alone, look around you. You're not the only one who's having problems. If you join together,
Yeah.
it's a call for action. I said that should have been the, when they had that movement, the Occupy movement, that should have been the theme song.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it would have been fitting for sure.
Perfect. And then he also talks about the downside of labor unions, links on the chain. So
Mhm.
that's also on here. The
Right.
fact, if you think about labor unions are great, but my God, if your uncle or your father wasn't in, you're not in either. And it really discriminates
Right.
against the people. So there's that. And then that was the president. He really loved John Kennedy. And he wrote a very moving song about him after he died. And then even talks about the electric chair. Iron Lady is about the electric chair. And then he took a very old poem. I mean, it's so eclectic. The Highwayman
Yeah.
by Alfred Noyes. And I think he wrote the perfect melody for that song. It is so stunning. And when I was teaching, I used to use that in my classroom. And the kids, no matter what background, absolutely loved it. They got it because it was such a beautifully told story. And then he did record one song by somebody else, which is Ballad of the Carpenter by Ewan McCall, which is
Right.
about Jesus, which is a really, really beautiful song. And so he included that. And then another song that the words were somebody else, but he wrote the melody, and that was The Men Behind the Guns.
Mhm. Yep.
And then Days of Decision, there's a guy in Wales who contacted me recently, and he wanted to do an album of Phil's songs. His name is Martin Joseph. He's been around for 20 years doing music in Wales, and he's been over to the States. He's performed here, and he decided he wanted to do an album, and that's what he called his album, Days of Decision, and that song is on his album. And that is so today. I mean, that's the thing about Phil. It's a freaky thing. He's been gone 47 years.
That's
And
great.
so many of his songs are still relevant.
Yes, I make that point in the podcast as well. I mean, it's remarkable. It's like,
And that one, more than anything else, actually, if you think about it, these are the days of decision. I mean, my gosh, how up to date could you be? And let's see. I didn't mention In the Heat of the Summer, which again is still relevant with all the racial crap that's going on. And I did mention Here's to the State of Mississippi. He did that one over. One I love, where was it that I read? Oh, on Days of Decision, he says, this is on the album. You don't have the actual album, do you?
I don't. I was going to actually ask you to show the listeners the back jacket if you could.
The back jacket.
Yeah.
You
Cool.
know.
Yeah, I've only had it on CD and of course now through streaming services.
Oh, this you'll find enlightening. On Days of Decision, tell me what that this wasn't written yesterday, okay?
Sure.
This is Phil's take on it. The American politician has developed into a gutless master of procrastination with a maximum of non-committal statements and the barest minimum of action. This moral vacuum is exceeded only by the apathetic public who allows him to stay in power. How feeble is the effect of a song against such a morass? But here it is. But I mean,
Yeah,
that could have been written today, right?
yeah, it's like he's a political commentator today. It's
right. And then other things that are interesting, not from this album, but with relevancy. Take the song There But for Fortune and the line, show me the ruins of the buildings once so tall. One of my, I do Phil Ochs song nights, and one of my musicians took that song, changed one word, show me the ruins of the towers once so tall. And it's like,
Wow.
wow, you know. And then what was the other one? Oh, in I Ain't Marching Anymore. It's always the old who lead us to the war, always the young to fall. And one of my musicians added the second time around, it's always the rich who lead us to the war, always the poor to fall. I mean, so
Yeah.
47 years later, and it's still, he was amazing. He was an amazing writer. He really was.
Yeah, and he just picked up in addition to the right. I mean, everyone talks about his lyrics because obviously they're so
Right.
brilliant and impactful, but like he was a really gifted musician too. I mean, his
I thought
melodies,
so,
I
yeah.
think, are very strong, and I think he was a pretty fine guitar player as well. And you know, it's easy to forget about that just because the words are so powerful. You know?
Mhm. And a lot of people put him down for various things. I laugh at him. His second songbook, which I think is called The War Is Over, has a black cover. And inside there's one page called The Critics Raved. And it's a whole page of like one-liners of negative reviews that he got. And it is very, very funny when read in that context. Yeah.
Seems like he had a bit of a sense of humor about.
Well, he did. Yeah, you have to have a sense of humor. Yeah. But anyway,
So obviously around this time he was amongst all the folk legends, if you will. What was his relationship like with Dylan?
that was very negative. Anybody will tell you that. Dylan was, I personally do not like the man. Okay. That
Fair.
I will say that he has written some really powerful, great songs, a handful of really classics, but he's very self-involved. And he seemed to get his rocks off by hurting Phil. I mean, he would put him down. And you can ask anybody. A lot of people heard this. They saw it time and again. I think back in the beginning, he may have been insecure, but he had to be the star. And what's better way? Was the same thing that our dear ex-president does. Making fun of other people and bullying them. And this was, you've probably heard the famous car incident where they were riding in a car together, and as they all did in the day, Dylan had written a new song, and he said to Phil, "Here, listen to this, see what you think."
Mm-hmm.
And Phil listened, and Phil was very honest, very, very honest.
Right.
He said, "Bob, I don't really think that that's as good as some of the other stuff you've written."
Mm-hmm.
Well, Dylan got so angry that he had whoever was driving stop the car, and he said to Phil, "Get out. You're nothing but a second-rate journalist. What do you know?"
Crazy.
I mean, so I'm sorry, but I just have no love for the man.
No need to apologize. Oh, yeah, that's interesting. I wasn't aware of that relationship.
But he had a close relationship with Paxton. They were really good friends.
Yeah, that I know.
And Eric Anderson, they
Mhm.
were very close. And there were a bunch of them. They hung out together. Van Ronk was a very, very dear friend of his.
Right.
And there was a place on McDougal Street called the Kettle of Fish. It was down the end of the block. It was, I think, like a bar.
Okay.
And that's where they would mainly hang out. And they visited each other there a lot.
Right. Okay. And then it's at some point he decided to kind of move away from political music, sort of get into the music of Elvis, change his persona a little bit.
Yeah.
Can you discuss that period and how it was received?
Well, I personally didn't go for it. He moved to California and to the LA area, I think Topanga Canyon maybe. But all I know is LA has a whole different vibe that I personally dislike immensely. LA has no, how can I put it? Everybody in LA is from somewhere else.
Right.
There's no history there. There's no base. There's,
Mhm.
and everybody's trying to outdo each other. And like my brother Michael took me to a club in LA. I went out there way back. And in the club, they had the downstairs area, which was for the peons and other paying customers. And upstairs was where the important people sat. And that each record company, in those days, the record companies were the rulers, and they each had their own long table. And that's, if you were important, you sat at one of the tables upstairs. So Michael took me upstairs because, of course, he knew the important people. And we go upstairs, and he would introduce me to people. And within a minute or two, when the person found out that I couldn't do anything for them because I wasn't important,
Right.
disappear. Yeah. So I mean, that to me is the persona of Hollywood. It's like trying to get ahead and trying to be the top. And, I just don't like that kind of a feeling. And it wasn't, New York was not that way at all. They were all buddies. They hung out together. And
Yeah. And he, so do you think he just got intoxicated by trying to be
other people were, well, I guess Dylan was one of the leaders in this, going electric and, trying to change your way. I mean, Pleasures of the Harbor, I believe, is probably Phil's top selling album.
Right.
And it has some beautiful, beautiful songs on it. And the orchestration is fascinating. His piano player, Lincoln Mayorga, is unbelievable. He did Small Circle of Friends. He does that honky tonk piano. You're really, really good. And the song itself, Pleasures of the Harbor, it's like a concert piece. I love that song and the way it was recorded. But to me, the highlight of Phil is the early stuff that he did, the early songs that he wrote. My favorite album is the In Concert album.
I agree. Yeah.
And I mean, you think about it, go back to the day. I remember when he did that was his first Carnegie Hall concert, January, I think 6th, was January 1966, that I know for sure. And I went with my mother and my grandmother, and I don't remember who else was with us. They gave us seats 4th row center. Those are the best seats, by the way. Front row is not the best because you're craning your neck and it's not comfortable. 4th row center is where they put the critics so that they'll get a good review. So we were 4th row center. And I'll never forget, I'm looking around and I'm thinking, my God, my brother's going to be up on the stage all by himself. And all of these people have sold out, of course. All of these people are here to see him. And I was just so proud, so proud. And I turned to my grandmother. I said, Grandma, what do you think? And I'm waiting for her to say how wonderful her grandson is. Her reply, she looks around the auditorium and she says, a barber could make a good penny here. So she kind of put things back into
right.
But the thing that is so amazing, that particular concert I remember so well, here is one man up on the stage with one instrument and one microphone.
Right.
Think about it.
Yeah.
I mean, today, when I do these shows, I freak out because the performers I get to do the shows, I mean, the wires, you practically kill yourself tripping over all the wires to get to the microphone. It's crazy.
Right. And yeah, it's just stripped down, but it's all he needed.
It was the words that were important.
Yeah. Right. And at the time, too.
Right. And then if you go into folk rock, to me, I do radio. I've been doing radio off and on for over 30 years. And, I constantly get CDs in the mail. Sure. And whenever I'll put a CD on, the minute I hear a bump, bump kind of drum, out. I don't hear it.
It's not on that back shelf there, huh?
Why do you write the lyrics if you can't hear the damn words? I mean, they drown themselves out. It's nuts.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. It's amazing. Yeah. So then he, I guess it was in the early 70s, perhaps. Then he started to take on causes outside of America. It was in Chile and Argentina, I believe.
Well, I don't know about Argentina, but Chile.
Okay.
That was very crucial. He went to Chile and he met Victor Jara.
Right.
Who was he was Phil Ochs plus of Chile. He was a known and loved folk singer, but he was also an actor and he was an activist and he wonderful songwriter. And Phil went down to Chile and I think they accidentally met on the street. Victor saw Phil and introduced himself, took Phil to sing for the Miners. down there, and so they actually had interaction. And then when the coup came along and they murdered Allende, they arrested Victor Jara, and they tortured him in the stadium and then killed him. And that really affected Phil. He was really, really upset by that.
Yeah.
And he actually put together a concert. This is okay. I'll have to say one good thing about Dylan.
Right. That's I was going to ask. Yeah.
Okay, so he put together a concert with friends of his who helped organize it. And Phil, by the way, was also manic depressive, which was bipolar, as they call it today. And he was in one of his manic stages, and he put this amazing collection of people together. But they called it An Evening with Salvador Allende.
Mhm.
You're going to go to see his show. Evening with Salvador. Who the hell is Salvador Allende? Americans are so ignorant; they don't know. They don't really keep up with any news outside of the country. So a lot of people wouldn't even know who Salvador Allende was or what happened to him. And tickets were just, he had good people. He had Van Ronk, and he had Melvin Van Peebles. I forget who else. Arlo, I think, was there. But the tickets were not selling, and they were going to lose money big time. Now, I don't know who, I think it was probably Phil, called up Dylan and basically begged him to come and be part of the show. And Dylan agreed. He decided he would do it. So he came, and the place, it sold out.
Right.
So he did Phil out favor. But the concert was a benefit for Chilean refugees, because a lot of people, socialists, were fleeing the country because the junta had taken over and they were going after people.
Right.
And so this was a benefit for them. And so that was one of his foreign adventures. He went to Africa. I don't know if he went once or twice. I know that he did a concert in Johannesburg, which was awful, because he was drunk, and he really, I have the review somewhere that was in the paper about how bad his performance was. But also, while he was there, he went for a walk on the beach. I forget which country he was in, and he got mugged.
Yeah.
And strangled, and that really destroyed his vocal cords. He lost about the top 3 or 4 notes of his singing range, and that really upset him. That really knocked him for a loop. Right. And,
and then he returned, right? And I think, was it around this time where he took on that new identity of the John Butler Train identity?
that was so nuts. That was part of his manic craziness. Yeah, he called himself John Train. I have no idea what that was about. He was crazy. And he was just acting out and very violent, actually. And at some point, he was actually sleeping in doorways. I think he knocked on Van Ronk's door, and Van Ronk wouldn't let him in, which I don't blame him. He was right. Phil was crazy. Mm. And then he crashed, and then he called me up and he asked if he could come stay at my house for a couple of days, and I said, of course. By then he was quiet. Had he been the way he had been, I wouldn't have let him in. Because I had children,
Yeah.
And so he came out to stay with me, and it ended up being about at least 3 months. But he was in the depressive state, so he was very quiet, and then he killed himself.
Yeah, and he wouldn't accept help, right? It seemed like people were trying.
I kept asking him to go for help, and he wouldn't go. One of the things back then, if you had manic depression, there was only one drug that they gave out, and that was called lithium.
Right. Yeah.
And lithium is what they call a flatliner.
Mm-hmm.
You have no highs, you have no lows. You just.
Yeah.
And for a creative person, that's horrible. You can't do anything. But anyhow, so the last week of his life, and I finally got him to go to a psychiatrist to get the medication.
Sure.
And he went once, and he got a prescription that he had a bottle of lithium tablets, whatever. And every night I'd say to him, Phil, did you take your medicine? And he'd say yes. And after he died, I found the bottle. He had never even taken one.
Right. Yeah. So I think I know the answer to this question, but I'd like to get your take on it. What do you think he would think about today's political climate?
Oh my God, he'd be writing 24
Yeah,
hours a day. There is more material out there today than you can.
right. He'd be pretty active, I think.
Oh, I think so, definitely. My God, there's just so much.
Yeah, but there seems to be no voice now.
Oh, no. You see, that's where you're making a mistake. And that's not your fault. It's because of the freaking division of
Okay.
sources.
Let me rephrase, perhaps. There seems to be no central figure that people connect with in a mass.
There's no one person, well, there was, but he died, Pete Seeger.
Oh, sure, yeah,
But there are a lot of them out there who are writing the same kind of music as Phil wrote.
right.
People who are wonderful people. Okay, first of all, if you're not aware of it, are you aware of the internet station called Folk Music Notebook?
I am not.
Yay, another convert I'm going to get. Folk Music Notebook was started by Ron Olesko, who lives in New Jersey, who runs, I forget which one of the well-known coffee house, and he also has a radio show on a Jersey College station, FDU maybe. I'm not sure.
Oh, Fairleigh Dickinson, perhaps. Okay.
Could be Philly, but he's on one of those stations.
Sure.
Just if you Google Ron Olesko, you'll get him. Recently, I think, how many years? At least 2-3 years ago, maybe 4 years now, he started an internet station which he calls Folk Music Notebook, and you can access it by going to Google and type in folkmusicnotebook.com.
Mm-hmm.
And Folk Music Notebook is 24/7 folk music. Every day, every night, all day, all night folk music. He plays, well, he's the one who got me to go back on the radio at my show. I have a show on there on the 4th Sunday of every month.
On that station?
Yes.
Okay.
He has Marilyn Ray Beyer, who used to be on UMB in Massachusetts. She just took over Rich Warren's show, Midnight Special in Chicago.
Sure.
Her show is on there. Matt Watroba from Detroit, his show is on there. Rick Pagliari from Vermont, he does the show. I mean, he plays all of these. He does live at Cafe Lena. I mean, he does all kinds of interesting shows. Plus, there's just general folk music going all morning long, the whole morning. There's different songs playing from every kind of genre of folk. And so if you don't like one song, you might like the next one. You know, it's just such an interesting mix. A guy named Joe Jenks has a talk show where he interviews people. It's called My Highway Home. And Joe's very good. Joe was one of a group called Brother Son, who were also very political. And it's just John Flynn. I don't know if you know John Flynn.
I'm not familiar with John.
Oh, you see, this is what gets me.
But this is great. I'm glad that you're mentioning this. Yeah.
Okay, John Flynn. Okay, we do something called, we give out a Phil Ochs Award every year. It's the guy who lives up near me, he and his wife, who worship Phil. And each year we get together and we choose a performer who not just talks the talk, but also walks the walk, who goes out and demonstrates or does something really important.
Right.
Among the winners, we have had John Flynn. John Flynn works with prisoners in a prison down, he lives in Delaware.
Okay.
And he started a group within the prison, just prison guys talking.
Mm-hmm.
And he calls the group New Beginnings. And it's become so popular, it's spreading now to other prisons. And the recidivism rate of this prison is like 70-something%.
Mm-hmm.
The recidivism rate of John's group is like 20-something%.
Oh, wow.
He's making a difference.
Yeah.
After he did this, he's done this for years now. After they get out of prison, you know, all of a sudden here they're free now, and what? He got a phone call from a guy who had gotten out and said, "John, please help. Please come and have coffee with me. I'm desperate. I don't know what to do." So John met with this guy. Long story short, there's now a group called New Beginnings Next Step, and they meet outside of prison. These are ex-prisoners.
Okay.
And they've set up a program where they get them worked. They work, some of them work in the thrift shop. They get them free bus passes to get to work. I mean, it's just, so somebody like that And the songs he writes incredible songs. Check him out, John Flynn.
Absolutely.
He has a lot of albums, and a lot of his songs are very political. Most of, but so he was one of the winners. Charlie King, who started the People's Music Network, which I won't refer to that, but that's a collection of political musicians who meet twice a year, once in the summer at a camp somewhere, and each winter at a different city.
Okay.
They exchange music and they have panels and what have you. Charlie King was the founder of that. So he was one of our winners. Then we had somebody named, John McCutcheon, you know.
I know that name.
Okay, John McCutcheon was one of the founders of the Local 1000, which is a union of traveling songwriters. And so he's done so much that way, and he's very active in labor movement.
Right.
Pat Humphreys, who was, I probably don't know her name either. Well, check her out.
Yeah, no, it's great. I mean,
These are people who who walked. Pat Humphreys gone every year. They had the demonstrations down at the something of the Americas, where School of the Americas, which is a place where they train basically Central and South American people to suppress, suppress the population. But these are the kinds of people that I've been dealing with, and who are writing the songs, and they're still writing the songs.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, I'm aware that there are people out there who are making a difference and are impactful. And I'm really thankful that you mentioned all the names you mentioned and the stations and such. I guess more to the point, it's just, everyone knew, not everyone knew, but Phil was a very popular figure, Joan Baez, Dylan, of course. And
that was because they were the top 40 in their day.
Right. Yeah, it was popular music.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I wonder if that'll ever be again. If political music can
people get disgusted enough,
right.
Maybe it will, I don't know. But in the meantime, there's always been this undercurrent. It's been there all along. It hasn't gone away. It won't go away. But it's an undercurrent and not the main thing. And my thing is to get people like Tori Nelson, who I said is doing the podcast on Phil.
Right.
To get people like Tori to get out there. And we just did a Phil Ochs song night in Brookline, Massachusetts, which is a suburb of Boston.
Sure. Yeah, I lived over there.
Ended the show, two young women, independent of each other, came up to me and said, I love your brother's music. Now, these are like college age kids. And both of them said that they had learned about it from Tori. They somehow found her podcast. So and she puts stuff out on TikTok. I've got how many hundreds of thousands of people have seen her TikTok stuff, and most of it's about Phil.
It's great. It's great.
She's really spreading the word.
Right. Yeah, and that's kind of part of the purpose of this podcast as well. I mean, when I give people the list of albums, I'm shocked that there's a lot of people who don't know the name Phil Ochs. And I'm hopeful and desirous that, even if we can convert a couple people to his music and also his ideas, I think it's very valuable. I want to ask you just one final question. What would you like people to remember about Phil Ochs? How would you like him to be remembered?
As a very brilliant, honest, forthright, well-spoken voice for the left-wing movement. I mean, he was one of the founders of the Yippies.
Yeah. And then it seems like there was a point where he kind of moved away from them, right? With the Yippies and Abby Hoffman and such.
Yeah. Well, Abby was a piece of work. Jerry Rubin, on the other hand, people don't know this about Jerry. Jerry was so true to Phil right to the end. When Phil was living with me, Jerry was the one who stepped forward and really tried to help.
Yeah, I think I saw that. There's the one documentary I was watching, and I saw him being interviewed quite a bit. Fantastic. Is there anything else you'd like to add? Did I miss anything? Anything you'd like to tell the listeners?
No, just listen to folk music because you can learn so much from that, and check out the new performers. There are so many of them, really are.
Great. I want to thank you. Thanks so much for joining me. It was a real pleasure.
My pleasure.
Okay, take care now.
Okay, you too. Nice meeting you.
Nice to meet you. All right, there you have it. There's my interview with Sonny Ochs. For more things, Sonny Ochs, you can go to sonnyochs.com. I want to thank her definitely for her time. All right, let's do this thing. Let's drop the needle on side number 1, track number 1, and the tune is I Ain't Marching Anymore. This is one of Phil Ochs' most signature songs and a powerful anti-war statement written from the perspective of a fictional soldier who has fought in every U.S. war from the War of 1812 to Vietnam. That would be a very old soldier, and of course impossible. In the chorus, Ochs pulls no punches with the lyric, "It's always the old who lead us to the wars, and always the young to fall." And he's right. The average age of people joining the military in the U.S. is 19 years old, and the average age of a U.S. soldier overall is 23. As of 2022, the average age of a U.S. member of Congress is about 58, and a U.S. senator 64. So it is always the old who lead us to war, and always the young to fall. The classic version of this song, which is heard here, was released on the album, and all songs on the original LP features only Ochs playing the guitar and singing. Now, a later version of I Ain't Marching Anymore was recorded with the addition of a band, the Blues Project Band, which included Roy Blumfield on drums, Danny Kalb and Steve Katz on guitar, Andy Kullberg on bass, and Al Cooper. Cooper and Katz would eventually go on to play with the band Blood, Sweat, and Tears. The electric version has been added to reissues of this album. As far as the music, Ochs proves right away that he is a skilled folk guitarist, and his voice has a rich clarity and a pleasant timbre. By playing solo, Ochs can perform with a certain rhythmic looseness, and he speeds up and slows down tempos at will, and his strumming patterns change as well. And he does this to accent words and phrases, and it helps to get the message of his words across. Check it out. I Ain't Marching Anymore. Track number 2 is In the Heat of the Summer, which is another powerful protest song that discusses racial tensions, riots, and the struggles during the 1960s. The lyrics speak of police violence, looting, chaos, and the destruction of a city besieged by violence. It's an incredibly powerful song that is perfectly delivered. The Harlem riots of 1964 is seen as the beginning of a wave of riots that would engulf New York City. More riots took place in cities throughout the country until they began to calm somewhat in 1968, with the last being the Martin Luther King assassination riots, again 1968. These urban riots were unplanned and mostly attacked the property of white business owners. The riots resulted in over 150 deaths and over 20,000 arrests. Track number 3 is Draft Dodger Rag. From 1948 until 1973, young men were drafted to fill vacancies in the U.S. Armed Forces that could not be filled through voluntary means. In the song, a young draftee gives every excuse to the draft board as to why he is unfit for duty, with reasons such as poor vision, flat feet, a ruptured spleen, allergies and asthma, back pain, addictions to multiple drugs, his college enrollment, his disabled aunt, and also he carries a purse. As the song ends, the young man tells the sergeant that he'll be the first to volunteer for a war without blood or gore. Contrasting the seriousness of the lyrics of this protest song is the music and the singing, which is performed in a light, medium up-tempo, sing-along style ragtime presentation. Draft Dodger Rag. The next track is That's What I Want to Hear, which is a catchy number that discusses the struggles of poverty and hunger. Over the course of the 7-year period from 1959 to 1966, the number of Americans living below the poverty line was reduced from 39 million to 30 million, while the population continued to grow by 2.5 million per year. There are now nearly 38 million Americans living below the poverty line, accounting for an estimated 12% of the population. Track number 5 is That Was the President. On November 22nd, 1963, President John F. Kennedy was assassinated. Upon learning the news, Phil Ochs was, of course, deeply saddened, and his wife revealed that it was the first time that she ever saw him cry. He told his wife, Alice, "I think that I am going to die." That night, he wrote a song as a eulogy to the deceased president, showing his admiration for the man and his sense of sadness. There have been 4 U.S. presidents assassinated. This list includes Abraham Lincoln, 1865, James Garfield in 1881, William McKinley in 1901, and of course John F. Kennedy in 1963. President Theodore Roosevelt and Ronald Reagan both survived assassination attempts. In the case of Roosevelt, he was shot in the chest while campaigning, but the bullet first went through a steel eyeglass case and then a thick 50-page speech that he was carrying in his jacket before the bullet lodged into his chest. He went on to deliver the speech before even seeking medical attention, and the bullet remained in his chest for the remainder of his life. Track number 6 is called Iron Lady. It's Ochs' commentary on the death penalty and tells the story of a man's final moments as he's brought to the electric chair. Ochs takes an anti-death penalty stance with the lyrics, "Stop the murder, deter the crimes away, only killing shows that killing doesn't pay." Yes, that's the kind of law it takes, even though we make mistakes and sometimes send the wrong man to the chair. The first use of the electric chair came in 1890, and after, over 4,300 electrocutions have taken place. The last person to die by electric chair came in 2002. Now, the electric chair usually works, but here's a case where it didn't. In 1946, convicted murderer Willie Francis was set to be electrocuted, but despite being terribly shocked, the chair was improperly set up by an intoxicated guard, and he survived the electric chair. But 6 days later, they tried it again, and it worked. Check it out, Phil Ochs' Iron Lady. The final track of side 1 on the original LP is The Highwayman, which is a song adapted from a poem written by Alfred Noyes, published in 1906. A highwayman is a horseback robber who holds up strangers at gunpoint. In the story, the highwayman visits his love, an innkeeper's daughter, named Bess, and he speaks of a plot to get some gold and promises to return to her. Although he did not return, soldiers did, and they arrested Bess. She then killed herself with her musket. The highwayman heard of her death and returned to avenge her, but was shot down. All right, let's flip the record and drop the needle on side number 2, track number 1. The track is Links on the Chain. Many folkies like Woody Guthrie, Pete Seeger, Bob Dylan, and Phil Ochs often wrote about the need for labor unions to protect the working man from the greed and the power of big corporations and corrupt bosses. After unions came into existence, the lives of many working class people were changed. However, like any powerful organization, labor unions became too powerful and also corrupt. In the lyrics, Ochs speaks about the struggles and the pushback between big corporations and the unions. Ochs' lyrics make the analogy that for a chain to be strong, all of the links have to be solid, just as a labor union needs all of its members to be committed to the message and the fight for the labor union to remain strong. As of 2022, 10% of all U.S. workers are part of a union. That number has fallen over the last 40 years. For example, in 1983, 20% of all U.S. workers were in a union. Track number 2 of side number 2 is Hills of West Virginia. In this 8-verse song, Phil Ochs speaks of a drive through West Virginia and about the state's beauty, with lines like, "The red sun of the morning was smiling through the trees, the fog hugged the road like a cloudy, cloudy sea." As the narrator and his companions continued their drive, they also came upon some scenes of poverty. Ochs recites, "Among all the wealth of the beauty that we passed, there were many old shacks growing older, and we saw the broken bottles laying on the grass when we drove through the hills of West Virginia." Now, like all states, West Virginia has its problems. It ranks number 1 in the nation for residents with poor physical health, poor mental health, and activity limitations due to poor physical and mental health. Statistically, West Virginia has the highest obesity rate in the country. Their economy is widely dependent on coal production, and with a move away from using coal as an energy source, the overall economic situation in West Virginia has seen many struggles. Let's take a journey through the hills of West Virginia. Track number 3 of side 2 is The Men Behind the Guns, which is an interpretation of a poem written by John Rooney, who was a part-time poet and lawyer. The song effectively humanizes soldiers who go to war. Estimates for the total number killed in wars throughout human history ranges from anywhere between 150 million to 1 billion people. It's quite staggering. The Men Behind the Guns. This next track is called Talking Birmingham Jam. In the song, Phil Ochs talks more than he sings, which is part of the folk tradition. In the mid-1960s, Birmingham, Alabama was known as one of the most racist areas in the U.S. In 1963, Birmingham continued to make national headlines due to racial violence and unrest. On May 2nd, 1963, more than 1,000 black children left school and peacefully protested racial segregation. On May 10th, 1963, the Birmingham Truce Agreement was signed to allow for partial desegregation. The next day, Martin Luther King was forced to leave the city as a result of several death threats. It's a good thing he did at the time, because a bomb was thrown into the window of his house and another at a hotel room in which he was staying. As a result of the attempts on King's life, protesters took to the streets, leading to violence and the hospitalization of 50 people. This event was known as the Birmingham Riots. On June 11th, 1963, Governor George Wallace, a vocal racist, stood at the door with the National Guard to block 2 African-American students from attending the University of Alabama. President Kennedy stepped in, and Wallace eventually relented, allowing the students to enter. Then, on September 15th, 1963, the KKK bombed the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, killing 4 young African-American girls. These are just a few examples of Birmingham's long history of racism. Like many of his folk brethren, Phil Ochs fought hard to fight racism and helped raise awareness through songs such as this one. This next track is called Ballad of the Carpenter, which was credited to Ewan MacCowell, and it tells the story of Jesus' vision and death. In the lyrics, Jesus is portrayed as a visionary who was killed by the rich for trying to support the poor. These lyrics can be looked upon as a commentary against the corruption and the greed held by the wealth and large corporations, and Jesus may represent the ultimate labor union organizer. Now, although he was born Jewish, Phil Ochs was not deeply religious. Ballad of the Carpenter. Track number 6 of side 2 is Days of Decision, another powerful protest song urging our leaders to take a quick action against racial violence. And Phil Ochs pulls no punches here. Here are some lyrics. Dark is the danger that's knocking on the door. Now the mobs of anger are roaming the streets. There's been warnings of fire, warnings of flood. Now there's warnings of the bullet and the blood from the 3 bodies buried in the Mississippi mud. The 3 bodies buried in the Mississippi mud line is a reference to the death of civil rights activists James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwerner. This happened in June of 1964. The 3 men were abducted and later found in the Mississippi mud. Days of Decision is another example of Phil Ochs' genius as a political protest songwriter. The final track on the original LP is another powerful one. It's called Here's to the State of Mississippi, which is a vicious attack on another state that is known for its extreme racist activities. Ochs urges Mississippi to find itself another country to be part of. With each verse, Ochs calls out different members of the community, and his attacks get more specific. At first, he calls out the state itself, and then the people, the schools, the police, judges, government, laws, and churches. There's no real symbolism or innuendo in his lyrics. It's basically a very clear statement in which he urges the state to stop supporting racism. Here's to the state of Mississippi. All right, there we go. We did it. We listened to the album, we made it through, and we're certainly better for it. So you can lift the needle off the record and put it away. So in conclusion, I Ain't Marching Anymore is one of the great protest albums. Phil Ochs takes on many social and political issues, and he does it head on and presents his lyrics clearly and poignantly. Musically, his acoustic guitar playing is very strong, and his vocals are clear and they are effective. And in addition to his inspired lyrics, Ochs also proves to be a pretty strong writer of melodies. Phil Ochs really needs to be better remembered for his message and his music. Today, the world could use another Phil Ochs. As always, I want to thank you for listening to the program. I hope you enjoyed it. For all things regarding the podcast, you can go to 30albumsfor30years.com. You can also check out my book, A History of American Music, 1750 through 1950, an origin story. That's available through Kendall Hunt. And also check out Sonny Ochs at sonnyochs.com. Together, let's keep this music alive. We have some great programs upcoming. I hope you have a wonderful day.